priests knew a wave was coming.
Russell, you've now got a reputation as one of the leading cinematographers in Australia, and you've also got an international reputation. Now, I know that probably doesn't occupy your thoughts when you're working every day, but is it something that you always wanted, or has it sort of dropped into your lap?
I guess it's dropped in my lap to a great degree. Particularly an international reputation is something I never ever considered. And I guess, I mean, it's always a bit of a surprise to me, but one just keeps on working and working and working. And I'm not terribly career conscious anyway, so I don't really consider it all that much.
Yeah. Well, why do you like the work? What is it that appeals to you about it?
Well, there are certain elements that I do like working in drama, whether pictures or TV or whatever, is, you know, working with a director, you know, a creative mind, and, you know, perhaps helping him contribute to, you know, create some mood on the screen. Also, I like working with cast. Love working with actors, and also my own crews. Like, I get a good team around me, hopefully, and it's just, I mean, I suppose it comes from years and years of doing it too, actually, where I haven't really done anything else in my life professionally. So it's just like a sense of family, I suppose, getting together in some sort of creative endeavour.
Mm. When you started out in the early 60s and you got into the industry, there was very little colour shot, wasn't there, because television was black and white?
Virtually none, actually. I think documentaries, a few 16mm documentaries are being made in colour.
So how did you learn black and white?
I guess through... I started off doing cinema news. I started off being an assistant cameraman, but then eventually going into cinema news for CineSound, then into TV news, which was still black and white. I guess I learned about the principle. I guess I got a feeling for black and white from watching early movies, actually, or movies of that time. And those sort of movies were a lot of those English dramas that were, you know, so successful at the time in the sort of early 60s. And a lot of the continental films, which were much more prevalent around cinemas in those days than they are today, and much more accessible.
What are the problems of lighting black and white?
I suppose the real problem is collating a technical need and a dramatic need, actually, and putting them together, working them out so that you know, the tonal differences between your foregrounds and backgrounds and costumes and colours of walls. One has to be much more careful in the use of light with black and white to separate all the tones and to keep people separated from backgrounds or whatever. Dramatically, black and white's actually a wonderful tool, but it has to be used with, not restraint, but it has to be used with great care.
You shot a film recently with
Brian Thompson.
Brian Thompson.
Yeah.
Night of Shadows.
Had been better cops than Larry Lomax. Hell, he was just a regular Joe, trying to hold his own in this stinking jungle.
But this case was starting to get to him.
Better keep an eye on him, Steve. But Steve had problems of his own.
Boy, if I got problems.
Love left no clues for Steve Steele. Why did she leave him? Why? Why? Dull ache of his thoughts pressed into Steve like a mass of knife wounds into his own chest.
I saw it coming for weeks. Weeks.
Watching her,
Following her.
expecting the worst.
Honey? Honey? Is that you?
She walked through grimy streets and gray winter parks, alone. He wanted to run after her, catch up to her, walk together. Then one day she caught the train and left him in the shadows. Behind his newspaper. Behind his Lucky.
There are a lot of effects in that. Were they hard to create, or were some of them easy to create?
Well, basically what Brian was after in that film was he wanted a look of the period, and I think one
What, the
could actually-
50s?
Yeah, the 50s and 60s, and a sort of crime, whodunit, B grade, that that sort of area, black and white.
It's a film of a radio serial, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it was actually lit the way a radio serial would look if it was visual. I mean, we pulled out all the cheap tricks in the book and used them quite unashamedly, and it was real fun to work on, actually, and I'd actually wanted to work with Brian for quite a while, and I think, because he's got a great inventive mind, and that's actually one of the most enjoyable things I've done for a long time, and it was just like really quick 2 or 3 week shoot, very low budget, but it gave me the opportunity to like not experiment, but to like try some silly ideas that have been done a million times before by other people. And
What about the writer's office, for example? How did you like that?
well, that was, Brian's design philosophy was semi-theatrical, I suppose, in that, it was just 2 walls with, the remaining 2 walls of the 4-wall room were just Venetian blinds, and he wanted to throw strong Venetian patterns across, the cast and the walls to give it obviously quite a symbolic sort of feel. And it was quite, we used simple devices to light. That was just, in fact, an open-eye 10K, I think. In other words, a 10K without the Fresnel, which is just a very hard single source, it's a small source of light, putting out a lot of light. And in fact, all the lighting in what we've just seen, it's actually quite predictable, really, quite theatrical, and as I say, like, we're after a fairly B-grade radio sort of look to the thing.
How would it have been different if you'd lit it in colour then?
It wouldn't look at all the same, actually. You might even use the same devices. Had Brian been going for something contemporary, whether the thing would have even been made in the first place, I don't know, but if it had been contemporary film, it probably would have been lit with a lot more soft light, gone for more modelling, more realism, probably even more subtlety. There's nothing too subtle about that film, but that's what makes it work too, actually.
When you made the transition to colour in your own career, it was also a time when films were moving out of studios and into realistic locations. I suppose one of the reasons was that we had no studios here, right?
That is, we still don't really. We don't have many, perfectly soundproof studios, which is a great shame. There's no big big studio complex where you could have 2 or 3 pictures running at once with production offices and lots of parking. And anyway, that's another beside the point. But it's true that I think most of the current sort of Australian cameramen who are shooting quite a number of pictures all came up through that school of, we had to make do, actually. Even our budgets were so small we couldn't afford sets, actually. And as you say, there were no studios to build the sets in, that were really totally soundproofed and fully equipped. So we all came through that school of, this is what you've got to make the best of it.
And would you say that it was a sort of a realistic approach to lighting, or?
I think it. Do you mean realism?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Basically, we used to and still do. I think one of the roles of a cinematographer is to when he's lighting a set, he sometimes can only light it from where he can light it. I mean, if it's, it's 270-degree angle that the director wants, in other words, like with a pan or a wide angle, lights have to be put where they can be hidden, where they can be out of shot. Well, this shot in Summer of Secrets, excuse me, actually reveals, although not to an audience, but to a trained, I would actually reveal some of the problems we had. It's not quite a 360-degree shot, but it's a very long scene. Oh, it's quite a long scene, all done in one shot. I think it's about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. And the camera hardly ever stops moving and tracks forwards and backwards, and obviously most ceilings come into shot at one stage or another.
Wonders of modern science.
So I had a very wide angle the camera had a very wide angle of view, so we had to light that scene practically totally from practical light sources that actually worked as far as exposure and mood went. And you'll see as the shot progresses there are a lot of tennis court shades overhead down one wall, which in fact were throwing light over the bench that's on the left of frame and right across to Arthur, I think. It was Jim Sharman's idea to shoot the entire film on a wide-angle lens, which we did, on a 20mm, which is quite a wide-angle lens. A lot of our lighting was, in fact, light sources that were on the set, which, in general terms, don't usually work for you, usually simulate the light that they're giving for a couple of reasons. One, that they burn out very easily if they are a working light. So normally you control those by dimming them off, and then you substitute the light source from somewhere else out of shot. In fact, because on Summer of Secrets we were often looking up into ceilings, we couldn't really hide lights up there anyway. So it was quite a challenge.
Is it a problem of getting enough light on the set to...
No, these days that's not a problem because film stocks are getting faster and faster and lamps are getting more efficient. The problem is being able to sustain a mood and also a continuity of your lighting mood from one scene to the next, or even one shot to the next within a scene. That's where the problem comes in.
So how do you solve that problem?
I guess with practical ingenuity, really. I mean, you have to... you certainly have to relate one shot to the next and one scene to the next to continue the flow. Like the editor must continue the flow and the pace of the movie. The cast must, the director must too, obviously. So director of photography must also continue the flow so that I think the audience doesn't get disturbed by any sudden, change of pace or change of design or change of method.
Picnic at Hanging Rock, which you shot before Summer of Secrets, was also very much a mood piece, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Creating a mood. How did you go about creating the mood?
We certainly had quite a few discussions about how the film should look, but anyway, the style was settled on eventually to be towards the soft and romantic look, and rather than like a highly dramatic, realistic or even theatrical sort of look. So once again, I mean, the device used in that, as far as I was concerned, to soften the image off was mostly in the choice of a net in front of the lens, which was a fairly old Hollywood technique for softening or diffusing a sharp image. And the rest of it came in really in the design and the choice of location and the light that even on the exteriors, the time of day would shoot certain scenes. So, the aim, we're always conscious of trying to keep a backlit look, which is romantic, which was aided by the use of the softening gauze on the front of the lens. And it was nothing new, but it certainly, I think, captured, the romantic sort of side of the story quite well. And I guess the opening scenes in the film where the girls are established in the school, in their various rooms, was obviously fairly deliberate in style, both in, art direction and the way it was lit. And we had talked about beforehand, I don't know whether we'd actually talked about David Hamilton per se, but like we were after that art-directed window lit, single source light, sort of evocative sort of lighting style and visual style. And it was no accident that we, used a net, as I've talked about before.
So are you using daylight there, or?
Oh no, there's certainly the addition of artificial light. There are a couple of shots in here that were strictly daylight, and I think all I added was a bit of fill light, which is like that shot there. I don't think I think that's totally naturally lit from memory. I may have had a little bit of fill light just for detail on the faces, but that's very evocative of the mood that we continued on with.
I love thee, not because thou'rt fair, softer than down, smoother than air, nor for the cupids that do lie.
This opening scene, which is a credit scene, I think, is did set up the whole look and the feeling that the film would continue with.
Did you shoot that early?
We did shoot this quite early, actually. In fact, we shot all the scenes on Hanging Rock first, then we went to South Australia. But as soon as we got there to the Appleyard College, the set of Appleyard College, or location, these were deliberately scheduled early up to in fact set a style both for the girls, for the cast, and for us to feel comfortable with and continue with.
It was an early film for you, and I wonder if did you get yourself into some holes?
Yeah, I think.
Would you do the same thing today? If
No,
you were
I
shooting
know
again?
some of the night exteriors came as a bit of a shock. I don't think at that stage. Picnic was the third movie I'd worked on, I'd shot. And I think it had the biggest of the night exteriors that I'd ever had to handle. I was pretty green in those days, and I remember I got shocked some of those nights at how much was required of me in such a short time, and where I knew then when I had to whereabouts were the areas that I could learn things, or had to learn things.
In order, because you were using that gauze on the exteriors, on the exterior scenes, you had to shoot with a fairly wide aperture, didn't you?
Yes, we did. Well, that of course
create problems for you or not?
It did actually, and in fact, there's one shot in Picnic still in there that where you can actually see the pattern of the net. So we had to shoot all our exteriors at around, I think it was between 2.8 and 4. So I constantly had to ND down for the exteriors, which actually it created problems mainly for the focus puller because he had shorter depth of field, but it certainly added a look to the picture as well, I think. In other words, it separated foregrounds from backgrounds, and I think just added to the romantic look as well, rather than having a deep focus look, which was the look of Summer of Secrets, where everything in the frame from foreground to background is sharp.
A little more expression in the face, sir.
You've shot 4 films with Peter Weir. What were the special problems with Last Wave?
The most special problem with Last Wave was the water, the rain, not only in terms of comfort, but also in terms of, for me, for lighting of it. It was something I hadn't actually come across before, other than on a small scale. And most of our rain was night exterior on Last Wave, which yeah, it does present its own problems.
Enormous practical problems.
Yeah, mostly practical problems, but also, I suppose, aesthetic problems too. I mean, a careful balance between reality and I suppose theatricalities has to be achieved. Actually, rain's actually very easy to overlight. It's as easy to overlight as it is to underlight. In fact, and if rain looks overlit, in other words, too much backlight, it can look terribly theatrical or in fact, actually, with a high degree of backlight, rain can actually, in fact, wipe out the whole picture. The rain can become so hot that it's just wipes out all detail behind it or in the middle of it.
And yet you can't see it if it's not backlit.
Exactly. And of course, the lights have to be buried out of shot. So, I suppose one of the good things about it is though, like the effect is immediately obvious by eye, and with a bit of experience, one can learn how to control it, or how to, in fact, to have flexibility up his sleeve on the moment of shooting. So that, I mean, these days I tend to use mini brutes as backlight for rain, so that we can very quickly kill a row or add a row to it. So that if I haven't got quite enough, I can just add a bit more without having to add another lamp. Or I can just knock it off very easily as well, because the mini brute has 3 separate rows of bubbles. I think Last Wave is probably a special effects movie that, if we were to attempt it today, we'd probably have, 20-man special effects department. With each effect having its own department, virtually, like rain being handled by a dozen guys, and it was a pretty ambitious project actually, but I think it came off. It was pretty important as far as my sort of learning process went, because it was it gave me the opportunity to learn one more facet of the movie making process, or it gave me the opportunity of having to deal with it as well, obviously.
What sort of specific problems in this house scene that we're looking at?
Well, I guess the special effects had to be used. I mean, they were a dramatic element of the picture, just the same way as that light is a dramatic element of the picture as well. Of course, they had to go hand in hand in that the effects had to be lit to be seen, lit to continue the move. On the night when we're doing big large special effects scenes, the technical problems you have of not allowing the lamps to get wet because they might blow up, or not allowing the camera to get wet for obvious reasons. I mean, they're problems you just have to deal with in a mechanical sort of way. But I mean, all I can say is that I suppose the lighting of effects shots the effects have to be carefully moulded into, the dramatic framework of the lighting. And that certain changes might have to be made rather than just lighting a regular dramatic scene. The effects certainly have to be treated as a separate element, but combined with the rest of it. I mean, this is what we're seeing now with Gopal and Richard Chamberlain is actually, very much essentially sort of part of the heart of the movie. So it had to be lit to dramatically enhance that.
I take you!
So there are valid reasons for having people who really know what special effects
Yes, there are.
on the screen.
Oh, there certainly are, actually. And in fact, a good special effects person could actually, in fact, suggest ways of lighting for the director of photography, actually. I mean, he might have had a lot more experience than the DP in that area. And in fact, when he's setting up his equipment, he'll probably know instinctively where the lighting should go. So,
Do you think it's a bad mistake to ignore that sort of advice?
it could be a bad mistake, yeah. I mean, there's plenty of room for learning, I think. And in fact, I dare say, I mean, it'd have to be advice you respected and and took as being right, obviously. But yeah, I know there's plenty of room for all sorts of ideas. I mean, filmmaking is very much a group effort, very much.
What's your approach to working with directors?
Well, basically, I believe that everybody on a film set actually should be working for the director. I mean, the director is really, to me, is the ultimate creative achiever in a picture. We're all there to support he or she. And my attitude is always to help create the mood, maybe contribute towards helping tell a story, which is very much part of a cameraman's role, which also is part of the operator's role, which I think we'll probably get into later. But I mean, I treated a director as my I guess alter ego, or as my mentor or advisor. And I mean, I'm sort of certainly there to serve a director.
Do you bring a special Russell Boyd style to a movie?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that at all, actually. I mean, one can in fact get labelled with a style, which I think is wrong. I mean, it's quite common for a lot of Australian cameramen to have shot 4 or 5 period movies. So, and it's quite likely if that's all we did, I mean, if there wasn't much opportunity to make other sorts of movies, we'd be labelled with, okay, he's great, but he's only good at, 1830 to 1837. But I think one of the good things about being a director of photography is that such a variety of pictures come along, and one can, in 1 year can, I suppose, cover a period from, the year 2010 to 1860 by doing 2 or 3 movies, actually. I personally don't think that style should stick to anybody. I mean, other people might disagree, but I'm certainly never conscious of a style that I've got. In fact, I'd go the opposite. I'd try and, if I thought I was succumbing to a certain style, I'd deliberately change it.
Well, take a film like Starstruck, for example, a mixture of styles in there, aren't there? So
yes, there are, actually.
But you're not consciously trying to create a style.
Well, I wouldn't say... I mean, for each individual picture, certainly a style has to be created, if you can call it that. But I'd hate to be labelled with that style for the next 10 years. I mean, as you say, Starstruck did have a few different styles. It had, let's say, some realism, which was the stuff in the scenes in the hotel with the family, both night and day, in the pub. And then the escape from reality, let's say the fantasy, which were lit more like rock clips, being all the songs, and when the kids were trying to escape from that more mundane life of the hotel, the lighting style as well changed, which one would assume, or one would hope, that enhanced those scenes.
Well, it's tricky in the jungle, and hide from the heat. Jungle drums are playing, a jungle beat.
See, this scene and most other scenes in most of the other dance scenes and songs in Starstruck were quite a challenge for me, in that they had to be lit quite theatrically, maybe like a rock clip, if you like to call it that. But it was an area that I hadn't worked in much before, and it's an area that I'd still like to develop. And I suppose it's one because I don't want any style. I don't want to stick with any style. Realism can become a bit tiring, I suppose, so this is a good chance to get away from it. And it's contemporary as well. And I think at that stage, one of the reasons I really wanted to do Starstruck was because it was contemporary. I can't remember the chronology, but I think, quite a few of the pictures before this were period pictures. it's a really good excuse to play around with some coloured light with no restrictions, virtually.
And a theatrical style of lighting that you hadn't actually had much experience with.
That's right. In fact, to achieve that sort of effect, we use a whole lot of different hardware, different types of lights, much more theatrical orientated sort of lights. And so that's all part of for me, that was all part of a continuing process of, I suppose, doing something different.
Did Jill Armstrong have very clear ideas about what she wanted visually on that?
Oh, yes, Jill's, yes, very much. Jill's communicates her ideas very well. And not to the point where she'd, say she'd rather have a pink gel than a green gel, but, I've always found it quite easy to communicate with Jill before a scene, either days before or actually on the set while we're shooting.
She told me that she found that she really didn't have enough time to achieve what she wanted with the songs, that in fact they were under-scheduled and that she had to fly a lot of it and didn't get the number of shots that she wanted. To what extent do you have to modify your own working plans to make allowances for that? In other words, can you cut corners and give the director more time?
Well, no, I can't. That's interesting because Jill, when the picture was previewed in Sydney, which is obviously, probably 6 months after we'd finished shooting and the editing process had gone on, Jill actually said to me the night, I remember at Hoyt's, we were having a few glasses of wine and I think it was dancing everywhere and people were generally excited, but Jill said that we actually could have gone further with the lighting of the picture, and I certainly agreed with her. I mean, I could have actually gone further. I could have made it more theatrical and probably made it more experimental in the lighting. But because, that was an early stage for me, that theatrical style of lighting, I probably held back a bit. But
there was also a time problem for you?
Well, there's always a time problem. I mean, time is all time is. Schedule is, what your expectations of what you can get through and what you do or don't get through. And usually expectations of what you can shoot in a certain amount of time are much wildly different to what you do achieve. And I think what Jill meant by saying that she would have liked more time is that, a dance that we did in 2 days, she probably would have liked to rehearse for 3 days before we even started shooting those 2 days, and then she probably would have liked another a 3-day shoot rather than a 2-day shoot. And whether it's dancing or drama or whatever, you always seem to run out of time. But it's not because I don't think it's because it's under scheduled. I think it's just that you're trying to achieve more with a given amount of time. If you had 10 minutes to do a scene, you'd achieve A. If you had 3 weeks to do a scene, you could probably achieve X. It's all subjective, really. But I know what Jill meant. I mean, I would have liked more time to light it. But at the time, I wasn't complaining. A lot of this is in retrospect, of course. But I would have, had I been lighting the same movie today in the same amount of time, I think it would have looked slightly different. I would have gone a bit beyond what I did in those days. But who knows?
I think it's a fairly crucial problem, actually, isn't it, in terms of how realistic the producer, if you like, is about what's going to happen on the movie. Because, and there are if you're making, for example, a Flashdance style of film, which I guess you could say that Starstruck is in a sense, there's a certain point of time and money that you can't really go underneath. You can't drop behind without really destroying the film.
Yes, well, I think, films that are shot in a hurry actually often have their own energy, I think. I'm getting a little disillusioned with pictures that pictures have a very long schedule. Once again, it's tied up with expectations of what you can achieve in a certain amount of time, and they're always wildly out in reality. But also, I think if you have a luxurious schedule, I think you can tend to become fat and lazy and slow. And I think, to me, that often does reflect in the picture's pace. So I think there's a fairly good argument for keeping everybody moving. And I'm not saying, you know, obviously that, you know, people should work sort of 7 days a week and 90 or 100 hours a week just to keep the energy going. But I think film has its inbuilt pace, which I think is generated by the pace that things made in.
That really brings us very, very neatly to Backroads, doesn't it? Because the Backroads is typical of something that you've done quite a lot, which is work on low-budget films and films where the technical facilities and the money certainly
Fairly limited.
are very limited.
Yeah.
So why do you do that?
Well, I think, I know why I did Backroads, because I was to get the opportunity to work with Phil Noyes. But I think also in behind my reasoning was that, I mean, it's always good to get back to basics, I think, if you can. Not that I'm saying Backroads is a basic film, or shall we say Night of Shadows, but I mean, in let's say in a learning sense, it's good to get back to basics. Good to keep your hands on the hardware that you started out with.
People in town, they just run us down and they gave us a big bad name. Say we drink and fight, but it's quite all right because
We went out and shot it.
it.
Nothing was really preconceived in terms of the shots we were to do or the design of the picture. I mean, there was virtually no art direction, really.
Shooting this sort of film's a bit like riding a tiger, isn't it? You just...
Yeah, I suppose it is, actually.
You've got to make the film happen while you're shooting
Yeah,
it, because
yeah.
it's only going to happen once.
That's right. Very little chance to pick up scenes either.
Nobody's gonna fucking bullshit that night. Take it fucking easy. No. Let's take it easy. Just keep cool. Look, you can see a kid anytime. Come on. Listen, fella, you come.
This is almost... It wasn't available like this, but it was from like a very small suitcase of lights that we had at our disposal from memory. And I'm sure it was all totally ad-libbed by the actors.
They're very funny fucking people, governors.
Backroads actually was a good opportunity on a mechanical side to shoot a lot of car interiors on the move, you know, real and practical car interiors, which, to say the least, they're awkward to both light and to shoot because you know the restrictions you have, lack of freedom you have, lack of angles you can choose, and lack of where you can light them from. It's actually quite good to, you know, get to do a series in a short amount of time.
Well, it'd be better than what you're doing now. Look at those poor bastards on the reserve, man. They've got no chance. Look at you. You're bumming around the fucking country. I don't work, but at least I've always got a bloody quid in my pocket, a pinch borrow or steal it. Christ, what are you
So I
doing?
just sat down and tried to work it all out.
Because it's a much smaller crew, communication comes in a much tighter circle, and there are much fewer areas where it can be misinterpreted. So, and that's the side I like of the smaller budget films.
Do you like operating?
I love it. I think it's one of the greatest jobs in film. Most people who've ever been operators agree, whether they're still operators or lighting, camera and directed or what.
Why don't you operate on features then? On big
Well,
budget features?
I guess it's just part of me. I mean, there are quite a few cameramen who do operate on their own pictures and in fact wouldn't not operate on their own pictures. I just like to devote my entire attention, not my entire attention, but I'm very fussy about my lighting, and I find lighting and operating for me is a bit of a distraction. I'd rather do one or the other on a picture. Usually these days, if something comes along that's 16mm and is for television, I usually choose to operate on that as well because the lighting is not, in fact, required to be as subtle. In fact, if it is as subtle, you usually don't really see the images on the television in the end. So lighting is my approach to lighting on something for TV is a bit more general, less subtle, because it has to be. So I just find myself a little bit more time to perhaps operate. And
So that'd be true of Backroads, that in fact the lighting was fairly minimal, I guess.
Well, I think we had, a small suitcase full of sun guns or quartz lights. I mean, there was virtually Backroads was virtually unlit as far as electrical lighting goes. I mean, most of it was natural light.
So what was Phil Noyce trying to achieve in that?
Phil was obviously making a statement, social statement, which also appealed to me. It certainly had to look documentary, and it had to look unrehearsed. I mean, it was a dramatised documentary, but Phil certainly wanted... he didn't want it glamorous, for obvious reasons, and so the approach was just to go and shoot it almost from the hip. Rehearsals were usually pretty much talking with his cast and just might be lying around on the grass just looking, getting a few ideas, but it was shot, as I say, very much from the heart, I suppose. Phil communicates at great length what he wants, but not necessarily in terribly specific terms, so that, I think while I could always sort of ask him, and he'd watch very closely because he's very knowledgeable, he'd watch what I was doing very closely, but we didn't have to, because he would communicate in general terms at great length, I'm sure I sort of understood exactly what he wanted. And I think in the end he was quite happy. The film looks pretty much as I think we intended it to.
So what's the operator's job in that situation?
Well, the operator has to obviously interpret, and quite intuitively at times, how the director wants to get the story across. He also plays a great role in being a mediator being a go-between between the director and the editor. And also on totally scripted drama, the operator has to do the same thing. He has to be aware of the pacing of the picture, so that he has to know when to let shots stop, when to stop panning, when to let people go in and out of frame, at what point to pan, at what point to not pan, at what point to... his sense of timing has to totally control all the movements of the camera, and the timing is actually directly related to, let's say, the choreography of the shot, obviously, but which also relates to the scene as it will finish and be cut into the picture. So, good operators in both dramatic and documentary senses have a great influence on the cutting of a picture. In other words, an editor can easily come across problems he can't cut out of a shot when he wants to because the camera's still gliding off somewhere. So the camera operator has to be able to interpret it for him and make the decisions where it should finish.
And be very much involved in the shot-by-shot telling of the story.
He is, yeah. Yeah, very much.
But as a director of photography, going back to larger budget films where you're not operating, as a director of photography, you're cut off from that element, aren't you? Not
really cut off. It's once again, it's fairly subjective how much effort you put into it. I certainly like to have a great amount of say in the operation, but often I don't, in that I might have a huge lighting job on, lighting a huge night exterior, and often the director and the operator will totally work out the shots we'll be doing that night, for argument's sake, and I'll have to learn them from them. But generally, I certainly prefer to be involved in the decisions, and obviously hope to have an influence in the decisions as well.
The director of photography's job has become more specialised, though, hasn't it? Because in the early days, historically speaking, when directors came from very often from theatre and so on, they didn't have a lot of idea of how to cover scenes, and it was very much the director of photography's job to really
tell the story,
shoot the picture, tell the story, choose the shots, and
I believe from the early days, actually, and which is, I suppose, where the term director of photography came. but I believe that most directors used to purely handle cast, and the cameraman would, in fact, as you say, tell a story through the camera. They'd select the camera angles, they'd decide how to choreograph the actors, and they, I suppose, had a fair say in how the sets were decorated, how the sets were built, and what colours to use. And I think a director of photography in those days used to exert a lot more influence in a lot of different areas. And as you say, today he is much more specialised in that he's got a fairly technology-orientated craft that he has to understand, but his I guess the DP these days does concentrate more and more on lighting to enhance to achieve a mood, and obviously combine, you know, a technical knowledge with a, you know, a certain amount of hardware that he knows can achieve the desired effect.
Does that open up an area of conflict between directors of photography and directors that in fact, to achieve a reputation or a creative result or whatever, the director of photography is saying, "Give me more time for the lighting, please, and hang the picture. I want a couple of days to light this, and when I'm ready, you can shoot it."
Well, I don't know. I think in all reality, and I think most working directors of photography know the score. And once again, I mean, it's my attitude that the director's the boss. In creative terms, I suppose, in production terms. I mean, obviously the producer and the first assistant director handle the production side of it, but, you know, I think as a director of photography, one has to know how far he can push, and when to actually, you know, when to stick out one's neck and when to pull one's head in, so to speak. I mean, you have to balance your priorities too, actually, and how, you know, I mean, I think a director of photography has to see his own role amongst all the others. Because as I say, like, films are made by groups of people, they're not made by any one person. And, you know, I don't think any one person really has any more right than the others to think his or her contribution is of the most major importance. Once again, that's my attitude. I believe that I've heard stories about other cameramen who, you know, expect the world to revolve around them, but I don't think it's really. It's not realistic.
Mm. You've shot some films overseas now, in America, particularly. How did those jobs come about? How do you think you got those jobs ahead of American?
Right. Well, all right.
directors?
We'll go in order, I suppose. The first one was Tender Mercies, which obviously I, even though I'd never worked with Bruce except on one commercial. With Bruce Beresford, who was directing Tender Mercies, and he did try and get Don McAlpine, who was off shooting something with Paul Mazursky, The Tempest, I think. And I know Don is Bruce's cameraman, if, you know, all things being equal. And so Bruce called me up and asked me if I'd like to do it, and as it happened, I had a few months in. I think Gallipoli had been put off for 6 months or something. Anyway, it slotted in perfectly. So, you know, much to my eternal sort of gratitude, I suppose, I got the opportunity to work in the States and work with Bruce, who I think is a great director for a cameraman to work with.
Mm.
He communicates all the time, and he's very organised, and you know, you always know exactly where you are with him. He won't muck around. If you want to know something, he'll tell you. If you've got an idea, he'll like it or won't like it. No problems. But anyway, so...
He wanted to work with an Australian cinematographer,
Yes,
didn't
he did. I believe he was offered his choice of anybody in the world, like the producer, because it was being shot in a non-union state, in Texas, which is part of the Midwest Union, but a lot freer. The producer said to him, "You can have any of the European cameramen you want." And Bruce, I know Bruce quite well now, obviously, so he obviously opted for Don McAlpine, but because Don wasn't available here, I think he just felt he wanted the trust and the knowledge of, you know, another countryman there. I guess, you know, for support and, you know, communication would be obviously easier. So
that's what it's all about.
Yeah,
huh?
fortunately I was lucky to be available.
Mm. What do you think you contributed to Tender Mercies? Or what particularly interested you about it, or what did you like about shooting it?
I think it was a good opportunity for me to shoot almost a whole picture by using a style known as window light. In other words, source lighting through windows. Because the house that was part of the little motel, was a totally practical set, so all the day interiors had to be lit from outside. I mean, the ceilings were only like, you could barely stand up in the room, so there was no way I could hang any lights above, other than a few practicals for night interiors. But so all the day interiors had to be lit through the windows. And sometimes we had, if we do a pan around in the kitchen and the doors were open leading off to the other rooms, we'd have like 4 or 5 rooms in shot. And they all had to be lit from outside the from outside the building. But it was in retrospect, that was something that was good for me, just to be able to refine that technique a little bit, I suppose.
See, he was alone when they found him, and they couldn't be sure how long he'd been there, or if he'd been in a battle, which battle, because there were 3 in that area that week. It could have been in any of them, they said. Or he could have been out walking, they said, and a sniper got him. Where would he be walking to? They didn't have any more idea than I did. He was just a boy.
As a director of photography, as a cinematographer, what's your raw material? What do you see your raw material as being?
The script, I'd say. Really, when it all comes down to it. I mean, that's where it all starts. I mean, then, communication with the director is part of my raw material. My crew, I mean, on a whole lot of different levels, actually.
You've got a special sense about light, though, too, haven't you?
Well, yes, I mean, I suppose the eyeballs are part of it as well, actually, in that, I mean, I've never really thought of it, what the raw materials are. They'd fall between mechanical things that exist and I suppose interpretive ideas that, can come. But, a sense of light is certainly what I consider to be, one of the most important, areas of sort of raw materials that, a sense of light, understanding what light is and understanding that light does exist.
Of course, your images wind up on a piece of film. What's your relationship to the emulsion you're under? Does that take a long time to get to know an emulsion?
I think it'll take me the rest of my life to completely understand emulsion. I mean, I think I've got it at the moment, to the best of my understanding, but it's taken me, I mean, I don't use many different film emulsions because I guess maybe it takes me a long time to really know exactly where an emulsion lies. In other words, part of the more technical side of my job, I suppose, is to transfer what my eyes react to onto a piece of film, which a film emulsion has different properties and a different latitude to the human eye. So I have to constantly relate the two, relate my eyes or relate what we see on the film set to how it will react with the input of light on an emulsion.
And this is interesting because you've got her walking out of the dark shadows of the house into
the sun,
into full sun.
Yeah. Well, in that case, I opted to let her go as far as detail, for dramatic reasons as well, actually, so that she'd... this is a fairly dark area of the script, quite honestly. I mean, he's talking about his daughter who's just been killed and how, whenever he's feeling good and luck's on his side, he always blows it. So, and which is, part of the essence of the whole movie. So I thought, get her to come out into full sun rather than trying to iris pull and all that nonsense. I didn't care how dark she went coming out. Which once again, I mean, I don't know whether that worried Billy Anderson in his cutting, whether he would have liked to hang on to, or Bruce for that matter, whether he would have liked to hold on to that shot longer on the inside before she came out into the sun, but I mean, it's just part of my interpretation. Same as an operator, like, has to interpret, as I say, interpret where the cut's going to be made, and it's part of my job as well in lighting a picture, actually. But that shot there is very typical of what we did all the way through it. And I think in 185, the little kid's feet were just above the frame line. So as you can see, we like really framed for sky very strongly to give it to open the whole thing up. Purely a device.